Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching us. And here we are again doing one of our webinars. As you know, my name is Anna and I work for Climate Tracker. And I have here with me today a very special guest, which is Dr. Saleemul Huq, which I will introduce briefly. Just to remind you, we are doing this webinar today because we are doing a very huge and nice campaign about the 1.5 limit to our temperature. And this is a webinar to inspire you, to give you ideas on what to write about, to learn from the doctor today, or to, I don't know, get super great ideas for your articles. So thanks so much for joining us, Saleemul. It's really great to have you here today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yes. Dr. Huq is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development since 2009, and he's a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And he has published numerous articles in scientific and popular journals, and has been lead author in a chapter in the IPCC, as well as coordinated with other lead authors in one of the other assessment reports. And he focuses very much, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, on climate change and sustainable development, and particularly from the perspective of the developing countries, because you are from Bangladesh, right?
That's correct, yes.
So thank you so much for being here. As you know, people who are watching us, you can send us questions, and that's the interactive part of the webinar. So if you are seeing this video, you will see that in a column next to me where I'm speaking, there's like a live chat. You can send me questions there, and I will ask at the end of this talk to Saleemul. And then if you are maybe seeing the Facebook page of this webinar, you can also post the questions there, and I will be checking. So we're really looking forward for your questions. But for now, I will start with some that I have prepared for him. And the first of all, it's the simplest one, I guess, which is, what's the 1.5 number, and what does it mean, and where does it come from?
Well, it has a long history. In fact, the temperature goal, or the temperature limit, where we would be able to prevent human-induced climate change causing harm to human beings and ecosystems, has never been scientifically discussed or agreed. But prior to the Copenhagen summit in COP15 in 2009, there was a big scientific conference organized by the UK government, in fact, hosted by them in Exeter, to try and come up with a temperature goal or a temperature threshold beyond which we would not want to go, or beyond which we would cause human-induced impacts that would be quite severe. And at that time, a consensus emerged around the 2-degree temperature goal. So 2 degrees became something of a generally accepted threshold or goal that we don't want to go beyond. What happened was that many of the least developed countries and the most vulnerable countries, particularly countries, low-lying island states in the Pacific and the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, low-lying delta countries like my country, Bangladesh, and many other drought-prone African countries and so on, we started finding out that even 2 degrees can be very, very detrimental to the poorest people living on the margins. And 2 degrees does not make them safe. And in essence, what 2 degrees does is it makes most people in most countries safe, but not all people in all countries, and certainly not all ecosystems either. And so if we really wanted to protect everybody on the planet, or at least most people on the planet, then the threshold needed to be brought down below 2 degrees. And we collectively agreed, as the least developed countries and the vulnerable countries, that the target should become 1.5 degrees. And that was something that the vulnerable countries promoted in Copenhagen, but they did not succeed. So in the Copenhagen agreement, well, in Copenhagen there was no agreement, but But in the Copenhagen discussions, the idea of 2 degrees remained, but something else was agreed, which was a review of the long-term temperature goal. And that review took place during the period 2013 to 2015. Scientists were brought in, they prepared a report, and they essentially said what I just said, which is that 2 degrees protects most people and most ecosystems, but not all people and all ecosystems. And that if we wanted to protect everybody, or at least almost everybody, then the threshold needed to be 1.5 degrees. So the difference between 1.5 degree and 2 degrees is maybe a few 100 million of the poorest people, most vulnerable people on the planet. And we are telling them, if we accept a 2 degree threshold, that we cannot protect them. We are not going to protect them. And this became a big political issue in the Paris negotiations at the COP21 2 years ago in Paris. And in the end, all the countries agreed that that was a morally bad thing to do. I mean, why should the world leaders just simply write off the poorest people on the planet because it's difficult? We know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And that's how we came to the agreement in the Paris Agreement, that the threshold remains 2 degrees, but we want to go well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. So we have enshrined the number 1.5 degree as a desirable goal. Now, whether we will reach it or not, there's a lot of debate about that. But it is something we have agreed that we want to do.
Thanks, super interesting. And of course, we don't want to leave behind that you said millions of people. So I want the people who are listening us to understand what can be the differences. For example, if you could give some examples of what changes we can see under 2 degrees and comparing them with what we can see with 1.5.
Sure. So what we are already seeing right now, since we have crossed the 1 degree threshold already since pre-industrial times, is we are seeing quite significant changes in the climatic patterns and some long-term impacts. For example, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is already being degraded very considerably due to both ocean acidification as well as higher temperatures in the oceans. And we are seeing increased incidences of typhoons and cyclones and flooding events taking place, as well as drought events taking place. So we are already seeing, with 1 degree temperature rise, the impacts of extreme weather events. With a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree, these will become much, much, much worse, and we will have to deal with them. Now, there is another side of the coin, which is that if you are rich and protected, then the impact on you will be less. But if you are poor and living in these most vulnerable areas, then you will be badly affected. And so the impacts are not uniform. They're not on everybody. They are going to fall on the poorest and most vulnerable communities, even in rich countries. So just to give you the example, when Hurricane Katrina hit the coast of Louisiana and New Orleans a few years ago, in the richest, most technologically advanced country in the world, they saw the hurricane coming. They were prepared for it. The rich people left the city. They left the poor people behind. And in the 9th ward of New Orleans, more than 1,000 American Black poor people died, and they could not protect them. And so poor people, in general, are the most vulnerable, even in rich countries. But in poor countries, there are more poor people, and therefore more people at risk. And so essentially, it is talking about protecting the poorest and most vulnerable from the impacts of climate change, which they did not cause, by the way. They are not the ones who emitted the emissions that caused the problem. And so there's a double injustice in that rich people cause the problem, but poor people will be the ones who suffer because of it.
Yeah, precisely. And of course, then we see a lot of differences between the impacts that developed and developing countries will face or are already facing because of climate change.
That's right.
I don't know if you want to add any other examples that maybe differentiate what happens in developing and developed countries. I know that many people who will be watching us are actually from developing countries, so that may be very, very interesting for them.
Sure. So in the developing countries, there are a set of ecosystem countries that are deemed to be particularly vulnerable. In terms of low-lying island countries like Kiribati in the Pacific, Maldives in the Indian Ocean, Haiti in the Caribbean, and others. There are delta countries like Bangladesh, which is on the delta of the rivers Ganges and Brahmaputra, Egypt, which is on the Nile Delta, Vietnam on the Mekong Delta, and so on. Major deltas are very particularly low-lying, are susceptible to the impacts of climate change, both from cyclones and from salinity and sea level rise. And then there are dry land areas in mid-continents, particularly in Africa and Asia. In fact, right now, California has had one of its worst droughts that it has ever seen. And people in California are suffering now. They're not dying, but it's causing a lot of economic damage to the fruit industry and the other agricultural industries in California. So in one of the differences, if you like, between impacts on poor countries versus impacts on rich countries is the metrics of the impacts. In poor countries, people die, but it doesn't cause huge amounts of monetary damage. In rich countries, people don't die, but it causes a huge amount of monetary damage. The California drought, for example, has already cost California $1 billion. The floods in Louisiana a few months ago cost Louisiana about $1 billion. So, they weren't very big floods by Bangladesh standards, but they still caused a lot of damage in economic terms because houses were damaged, infrastructure was damaged. So the metrics of measuring damage can be different. In poor countries, it's human lives and human livelihoods that are lost. But when you add them up in terms of economics, they may not add up to billions of dollars. But in the rich countries, in terms of people's lives, you don't lose lives so much, but you do lose a lot of economic infrastructure, which costs a lot of money. And so both rich and poor countries are going to be affected by the impacts of climate change if we are not able to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees.
Thanks so much. And I am sure that people who are watching us also want to do something about it. So we are encouraging them to publish articles in their media in their countries talking about these issues. So maybe the positive note or something that we want them to write about is, okay, what can we do at the national level to limit the temperature? So what kind of policies need to be in place, etc. What do you think?
This is very critical, and this is where we need to take action. As I mentioned earlier, in the Paris Agreement, we have agreed to take action. But at the moment, all the actions that are being promised, and we need to do a lot more. We need to reduce our emissions to bring down the temperature, and in many places which are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we have to develop adaptation practices to be able to deal with the problems because they're already happening. These are not going to happen in the future. They're already happening, and we have to deal with them whether we like it or not. In terms of writing about this, particularly young researchers who want to do research on this, I would encourage everybody to think about what the potential for, on the one side, reducing emissions to reach the 1.5 degree goal, on the other side, enhancing adaptive capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change, to do so in particular because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has commissioned already, it started work on a special report on the 1.5 degree temperature rise, which will come out in 2018. So if people can publish some good research before 2018, the IPCC will be able to pick it up and use that for advising governments on how to reach the 1.5 degree temperature goal.
Yeah, and the 2018 mark is really important for everyone for various reasons in the climate change UN process, but also for this IPCC report. So we are really looking forward to that. Do you think there's something else that needs to be done, not only at a national level, but also at an international level to limit the temperature goal?
Absolutely. I think what we need now at the international level are coalitions of the willing. the Paris Agreement has brought everybody on board. Everybody agrees what needs to be done. Everybody is doing something, but they're not doing enough. And so we need some countries to be more ambitious, to move forward, to move faster, to take the lead. Pleased to see that China, in my view, is actually moving forward quite fast. It is reducing its dependence on coal-fired energy. It's increasing its utilization of renewable energy and sustainable energy. And they're a world leader in this field. And if they can do it, then other countries can follow. A group of countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries, the 48 of the most vulnerable countries. They're a caucus group at the moment led by Ethiopia. At the last conference of parties, COP22 in Marrakesh, on the last day of the conference of parties, these 48 least developed countries, not least developed countries, most vulnerable countries, they made a declaration that they would all become 100% renewable by 2050 without requiring anybody to pay them money or give them technology. It was just a matter of principle they were going to do it. It was a unilateral declaration. The emissions of these countries are not very high, but that doesn't matter. It is the ambition to become 100% renewable and remove fossil fuel energy from the mix that is important. And they were showing the way forward and wanting other countries to follow their lead. And that's what we need now. We need more ambitious coalitions to move forward. We don't need 100% consensus. If, Mr. Trump in the White House in the US wants to withdraw, let him withdraw. Doesn't matter. The rest of the world must move forward, and those that want to move forward must help each other and move forward faster.
Thank you. And yeah, definitely, this was a very inspiring coalition that was presented in COP22. So I hope this continues. And do you think this is a way that national policies and international and the international level link up, or there's more ways where we see this interaction between national and international fight for this 1.5 goal?
I think it's a national and international interlinked system, but I would also add within countries, it's also a local issue, particularly on the impacts of climate change. The impact where there are particular places and particular communities, usually the poorest communities in any country, who are the most vulnerable. And therefore, the local impacts of climate change are very important, and supporting those local communities to adapt to the impacts of climate change is also a very important part of this global puzzle. We cannot neglect them. They are the ones, as I said earlier, who are going to suffer the problem, but are not the cause of the problem. And those of us, rich people like you and me, who are the cause of the problem, we owe them a certain responsibility to help them. And I do a lot of work on community-based adaptation with the most vulnerable communities. We organize an annual event called the International Conference on Community-Based Adaptation. This year, it'll be in June in Kampala in Uganda. Last year, we held it in Bangladesh, where I hosted it. And we bring together these communities. They're not sitting idle. They are being active. They are trying to do what they can. But they cannot do everything themselves. They need support from both the national as well as the global community. And so we need to link the international, global with the national and with the local and with human beings and people more generally. And this is something that everybody can be involved in. We cannot afford to sit and let somebody else do it. Every one of us has to do something.
Thanks, Saleemul. This is really inspiring. I hope you can take some notes, you trackers. But if not, you can see this again. It will be on YouTube. So I hope you can use some of his inspiring ideas for your articles. My next question would be, in your experience, because you were saying that you work a lot with these communities and I guess around the world, what's the best way that policy can turn into practice, particularly if we are talking about the temperature rise of limiting it?
Well, as I said, I work with the, if you like, the victims of the impacts of climate change rather than those who are causing the problem. And so my work is very much at the local level with vulnerable communities in poor countries, including Bangladesh, where my center is based. And one of the things that we do with them is to enable them to be able to understand the problem and take whatever actions they are able to do at their level. And by giving them knowledge of the problem, knowledge of the solutions, helping them build their adaptive capacity, they can do a lot. There's much that can be done. But if the temperature goes up too far above 1.5 or 2 degrees, then there are limits to how much they can adapt. And that's really why we need the rest of the world, those that are responsible for the emissions, to reduce their emissions so that they come down from where they are now headed, which is around 3 degrees, to well below 2 degrees, and if possible, 1.5 degrees. Even though it may seem difficult, it's not impossible to do. But we have to raise our level of ambition. So those that are responsible for emissions, whether they're countries or companies or cities or villages or humans or whoever they are, they need to think about their emission profile, and they need to think about how can they reduce their emission profile. As I said, every single one of us is an emitter of greenhouse gases because of the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the house we live in, the transport we use, the heating we use, or the air conditioning we use. And therefore, we have a carbon footprint, and therefore we are part of the problem. And if we accept that, then we also have to think, how can we become part of the solution by reducing what we can and making others also reduce the carbon footprint of our countries and our societies. And if we can get everybody on board that this is something we want to do, then politicians will take action and take the correct decisions. Investors are already doing that. If you look at the investment arena, the investments in fossil fuels, in coal in particular, is dropped. Nobody wants to invest in coal. And it'll be the same for the other fossil fuels. That's what we need to happen. We need a transition away from fossil fuels into renewable energy as fast as possible at the global level.
Thank you, and we hope to collaborate on that. And now I was thinking, because we are naming this campaign after the broader campaign that's called Survive and Thrive, so we understand the part of survival. No, it's a matter of survival for many communities that are affected by climate change, but it's also a matter of how great it is for our society and for our economy to do this transition and to live in a better and more sustainable world. So I was thinking maybe you would want to give some examples on what are the real benefits for the society or for the economy to do this transition.
Sure. So let me give you the example of Bangladesh, which I'm most familiar with. And as most people who are watching will know, Bangladesh is a very poor country. It's got 150 million people living on a very exposed low-lying delta of 2 major rivers of the world, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra. Has a very large low-lying coastal area where there are tens of millions of people who are going to be affected by sea level rise and are already being affected by salinity intrusion in drinking water. People are drinking saline water, which is causing health problems. And so right now we have 2 problems. There's the sea level rise salinity increase problem, and then at the same time there is a migration problem. People are moving from the rural areas into the city, and particularly they come to Dhaka, which is the major city or the capital city of Bangladesh. And Dhaka is already the fastest in the world. So the thinking now is, how can we not just cope with the problem, but find transformative solutions to the problem? And there's a 3-pronged planning process. We haven't invested in it yet, but we're thinking about it, which looks at providing fresh drinking water for the people in the coastal area for now, but investing in the youth and the children, the boys and the girls, and giving them education and empowering them and giving them skills so that they don't have to remain as farmers and fishers like their parents, but they can go and get jobs in cities or abroad internationally. And at the same time, to avoid everybody coming to Dhaka, investing in other cities which are inland, building the schools, the jobs, the hospitals, the opportunities for these people, because the time span is going to be the next 10, 20 years. These people are not leaving immediately, but over time they will have to leave. And so it's about making migration from a forced migration as it is now into a planned and facilitated and enabled migration for the next generation, younger people in particular, giving them the skills, giving them the opportunities so that they can not only avoid the problem, but actually be better off afterwards. But when they move, they will have to move, but they move at their own volition. They get a good job, they go to a town and a city, and then they take their parents with them afterwards. And so for the parents' generation, you try and help them now, but for the next generation, you build them the abilities and the skills and the capacities for them to move and get better jobs and better employment, and you create those better jobs and better employment for them to be able to move. And we are now talking roughly 10 million people over the next 10 to 20 years in Bangladesh alone. We have to think about that. What are we going to do? How are we going to help them? And as I said, this is now in our thinking process. We haven't started investing in it yet, but it's definitely in the planning stage.
Oh, 10 million people, it's a lot of people. But it
sounds exactly.
It sounds like a great idea, though. I hope it really succeeds.
We shall see.
Yeah, I hope. So my next question was linked to because I knew your expertise was also linking sustainable development and climate change. So I wanted to see how do you understand this link in this particular issue. So how is the temperature limit linked to sustainable development?
Sure. So there are two aspects to this. The first one, at the sort of global UN level, we have very separate but linked processes for developing the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 17 of them. We have agreed on them now with the time horizon of 2030 to achieve them. And then we have the Climate Framework Convention on Climate Change with the Paris Agreement with a similar timeline of 2030 to achieve the 1.5-degree temperature goal, and also a global adaptation goal, which is also new in the Paris Agreement. So these two go in parallel. One of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 13, is actually on climate change. So they overlap. So goal 13 of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement are basically the same. So by achieving the Paris Agreement, we will be able to achieve the SDG 13. But climate change doesn't only affect SDG 13, it also affects all the other SDGs on human health, on hunger, on poverty, on education. And so climate change is like a cross-cutting issue across all the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is at the global level. At the national level, it's also very important as countries develop their national plans, both for climate change and for meeting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which all countries are now in the process of trying to develop these national plans. They need to integrate the two again. And as I said, climate change is a very big cross-cutting element that cuts across at least 7 or 8 of the 17 SDGs, specifically number 13, which is climate change, but also the others. And so from a sustainable development perspective for a country, basically a country, particularly a developing country, has to find a path to developing which enables the poor people to no longer remain poor, the hungry people to no longer remain hungry, at the same time as reducing their carbon footprint and developing with sustainable energy in particular and sustainable transport systems, so that they don't do this by enhancing emissions of greenhouse gases. And that is now increasingly becoming possible. A few years ago, it sounded like a daydream, like impossibility. But now it's becoming increasingly possible as countries try to figure out what to do. They are actually finding solutions. And the solutions make sense. They don't come at a huge cost. We used to think that they're going to cost a lot, but they don't. And so the more you try to do these things, the more you enter into a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle. A virtuous cycle. By doing good, you do more good. And you get benefits from that. And we are already seeing a decoupling of human development with the use of fossil fuels and hence greenhouse gas emissions. Countries are being able to do this. In the developing world, it's easier because we're investing in new infrastructure, new energy. But even in the developed world, where they have a legacy of fossil fuels, they can move away from that into sustainable energy as well. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And I have one last question. As you know, at Climate Tracker, we work with young people around the world. And I wanted to ask you what you think young people can do to support this goal.
Well, I think personally that, me and my generation, I'm almost 60 years old now. We have failed the young generation. We have left them with this problem, and they are the ones who are going to have to solve it. And I hope they do better than we do. I now teach in a university. My center in Bangladesh is based at a university, so I interact a lot with young people, and I have huge faith in them. They are energetic, they are intelligent, they understand the problems, they want to solve the problems, they don't want to just continue the way we've continued. And so I have great faith in young people, and I'm now dedicating the rest of whatever few years I have left working with young people to help encourage them in any way I can.
Awesome. I really like to hear that. We also love to work with young people. And
Excellent.
we will try to save the world, I promise that.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And let me add one other thing.
Sure.
One thing that your generation has to a much greater extent than my generation had is the ability to be a truly global citizen. You can connect across the world. My young students in Dhaka, they're all on Facebook and on their smartphones, and they're connected to people all over the world in a way that my generation was not when I was growing up, when I was their age. And that's a huge resource, in my view, for expressing what I call solidarity. To me, the biggest solution to the problem of climate change and also poverty is expressing tangible ways of expressing solidarity between human beings across the planet, and particularly young people across the planet. Young people in Spain linking with young people in Bangladesh and in other countries. And you can do that now, like this, on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so on. And there's so many ways to enhance this interactivity and getting to know each other and combining forces and sharing ideas that we didn't have a generation ago. We do have now. And to me, that's another huge opportunity for the young people around the world to be more proactive, more connected with each other than the previous generations were.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's something I really like from
Good.
working with so many young people around the world. It's really inspiring to meet people. So I have for now one question from a tracker. I think he's from Trinidad and Tobago, but I'm not 100% sure. And he is asking, what policies can we put in place for oil-dependent countries to change the energy landscape in a sustainable manner? So of course he's worried about the oil dependency of his country.
Sure.
And want to see how we can make a transition to that.
Well, this is a legitimate question. I think, with particularly developing countries that are dependent on oil or other fossil fuels, cannot immediately switch them off. But they do need to think about a longer term transition away from them and looking at sustainable alternatives. And interestingly, one of the countries that has fought tooth and nail against taking action because it might affect their fossil fuel industry is Saudi Arabia, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, exporter of oil in the world, are now investing heavily in renewable energy because they have a huge amount of sunshine as well, which they didn't used to think about using, but they're now thinking about using it. So everybody needs to start thinking beyond fossil fuels because they won't last forever. Even in Trinidad and Tobago, use their fossil fuel to the last drop. It will finish at some point, and they have to think beyond it. And even in countries like UAE, so Dubai, these are all dependent countries that become rich on oil. And in fact, we need to think beyond fossil fuels. We can have them for, but they will not last forever. We replace them, and as quickly as
Thanks. Your connection was a bit broken in the end. I hope people could hear your answer. And for now, I don't see any more questions. We do have Boaz from Uganda, who thanks you for your faith in young people. He really agrees that that's necessary. But no one is sending any more questions for now. So I guess they are inspired enough to go and write.
People will watch it later on online.
Of course. So if you are now seeing us, you know that you can rewatch this and it will be on YouTube. So if you have any final remarks that you would like to make, if not, we can finish the webinar.
So let me make a final remark, and this is an appeal to anybody who watches it in the future. And if you can send me the link, I'll also send it out to my, my links and my networks. And if you're particularly, if you're a young person thinking about what to do, I would encourage you very, very strongly to think about the climate change issue, the problem, learn more about it, learn ways in which you can help link up with people, because I'm absolutely certain no matter where you live, there are people already doing something. You can find them, link up with them. There are young people in universities, outside universities, in every country, in every city. There are many, many networks. If you go online, you will find them. Link up with them, see how you might be able to help them. And if you're interested in learning more about it, then study the problem, maybe go and do a degree in it in a university if you're interested in studying more about it. If you're interested in doing research, you can do research about it. But climate change is really one of the defining global problems of our times, of the future. And if you're a young person, it's something that you should try and, you should at the minimum understand, and you should go beyond that, actually try and do something about it.
Thanks, Saleemul. And there's so many ways of learning about it now. So when we speak with young people and we ask them, like, how did you learn about all this? It's like, oh, I did an online course, or I read websites, and you're like, wow, there's so many ways of learning about climate change and to impact on the solutions. So yeah, I think we all had a very inspiring morning. For some others, time zones, maybe afternoon or evening. And we will thank you again for being here with us today, and wish you a super nice weekend and work ahead trying to solve the global problem. Thanks so much for being.
Maybe we'll see each other in Bonn next month.
Of course. Thanks so much, Saleemul. And thanks for all who are watching us. We will hope to see you very soon in our next campaigns. Goodbye.
Thank you, Anna. Bye-bye.